Hello everyone, welcome to the Crito Lecture, our first online lecture. And first of all, just warning, there might be some sounds around here. There's some construction happening, you probably heard some of that. Apologies for that, the acoustics are a little strange here and too many sounds where I'm at right now, but let's ignore that and focus on the dialogue. So, in this first lecture on Crito, I just want to focus on some of the most important points and go a bit quickly through the main arguments of the Crito with an intention of remembering some of the main questions that we had at the very beginning when we spoke about the Apology, which is, what is Socrates' power, or rather, how does he achieve the ability to be at peace or at ease and even happiness in a situation like he is, right? Confronting death, which I think most of us admire and would want to be that calm and collected in any circumstance, right? So Crito, the Crito is a part of this trajectory from the Apology, where he's already convicted, and his friend Crito, who he's having a dialogue with, really is trying to convince him to escape, actually. And so we're able to see Socrates speaking to a friend, but also we're able to see a bit more deeply into Socrates' character and belief system, right? Which is what we're in search of, or one of the things we're in search of in terms of answering the question, how does he achieve this level of peace and centeredness, etc., or this virtue that he has, that even Crito mentions, right? So in order to understand the Crito, let's remind ourselves a little bit of the context and then go into the rest of the dialogue, right? So we already know Socrates here defended himself in court using reasons and arguments and cross-examining his opponent's view, right, as opposed to appealing to emotions. This was one of the main topics or things that we observed in the Apology. But as we know, he was still convicted, found guilty with the penalty of death. In his defense, however, just as a very general review, in the Apology, we see a lot of his main convictions. Things like the wisdom of admitting that one does not know, right? He said he's the wisest because he knows that he does not know, as other people seem not to know, both back in his time and maybe in our times. You can evaluate that. Also, we see that he strongly is convicted that caring for a good state of the soul is the most important thing, a good state of the soul, or living a good life above all else, right, including death. And speaking of death, he goes further for many reasons into the idea that we should not fear death. One of the arguments, aside from it being a virtue in general, he says that not fearing death is a better idea because it may be a blessing, right? And he goes into some arguments that we covered in class a bit. And then he also says that his philosophizing is a divine calling. We covered that a bit in the Apology as to why he thinks it's a divine calling, to the point where he thinks philosophizing is his important duty to the point of death, right? Such an important mission for him that he's willing to die 1,000 deaths, he says. So that's pretty passionate, a pretty strong conviction there, right? So at this point now we're in the Crito, right? He's been convicted, and Socrates has been in prison for a month, waiting for his execution. And the reason for that is that there was a religious holiday at the time in Athens, in which no executions were allowed. You can think of, like Christmas time here, maybe they shouldn't be capital punishment, right? So that's kind of the idea. So there was a religious holiday They were waiting for some ritual ship to come back home, and once the ship returns, then, you know, he would be executed. So he's been waiting for this time, and since the time is approaching where the holiday is going to end, Crito, his long-term friend, lifelong friend, comes to him as a last attempt to convince him to escape and not accept his conviction of death, right? And so he attempts to convince Socrates, and it comes early in the morning while he's actually still sleeping and he's dreaming or wakes up from a dream. And Socrates says something very interesting. This will be a bit of a side note, but it's an interesting element to include in understanding the complexity of Socrates' mind, right? So he says he has a dream once he wakes up and he's talking to Crito. He says, based on the dream, he doesn't think that he will die the next day, which is why Crito was so urgently trying to convince him of escaping, because Crito thought that he will die the next day. But Socrates says, no, I'm going to die on the third day. And then he explains why, and he says, well, it's based on a dream that in the dream, he said he thought that a beautiful, comely woman dressed in white approached him, and she called him, he says, and says, Socrates, may you arrive at fertile Pythia on the third day, right? That he's going to arrive somewhere on the third day, which implies that he will go home, i.e. die, on the third day, not the next day, right? So he gives this argument to Crito based on a dream. Very interesting. And in fact, he does not die the next day. He does die on the third day. So it's an interesting fact that he includes dreams in his analysis, since we believe Socrates to be very rational, right? And he's within the tradition of rationalism, but he includes a lot of things that perhaps some people might not think so rational, right? Like dreams and the divine sign and so forth. So I will leave that as a sort of side note for you to contemplate, right? How is this part of a rational worldview for Socrates, right? Can you still call him rational, or is he being irrational, right? So I'll let you guys think about that. You can even journal on this if you like. So moving on, Crito then goes on to very passionately try to convince Socrates, since they're old friends, to escape. And he gives a pretty long list of reasons. I suppose he knows Socrates, so he can't just tell him, you know, please let's come and appeal to his emotions. So he actually attempts to give him a few rational arguments. And then Socrates responds by, not surprisingly, analyzing these arguments, right? And so let's go quickly through them. And I will just sort of list quickly the arguments from Crito and go a little more in depth with Socrates' response, right? So we're just giving a quick outline in this first lecture, and then we'll go deeper into some bigger questions later when Socrates gives his response, right? So the first thing that Crito says is he should escape because he will lose a best friend. So he, I suppose, is appealing a bit to his emotions. That he will lose a best friend, and that's a bad thing, right? That's a wrong in a sense. Another one that he sort of states is basically people will think that he, Crito, did not want to help his friend Socrates, that he was not willing to spend money, because no one would believe that Socrates would not want to escape, right? So they would put the blame on Crito and say, yeah, Crito, you should have helped Socrates, right? You must be sort of stingy and didn't want to spend your money in helping him. So he tries to argue that he will basically give him a bad reputation in a sense. He then moves on to a third argument, and he says, the many can inflict the worst evil on you, death. So he's reminding Socrates that he's going to die, and sort of emphasizes this is the worst evil that he's sort of allowing his enemies to inflict upon him. The fourth one is, he does not need to worry about his friends because the authorities do not care that he escapes. So he's saying, hey, look, everything's taken care of, and your friends have taken care of the money, and also, well, that was the next one actually, but I divided this into two parts. So he first says the authorities won't care if you escape as long as you're not in Athens, and then the fifth one is, your friends have taken care of the money issues, so you don't have to worry about that. The sixth one is, he has friends in other places that would protect him and take care of him, so he doesn't have to worry about where he's going. Number 7, we're going up to 12 here, is you are not doing what is right to give up your life when you can save it. So he seems to give an argument here where he's saying, look, if you have the opportunity to save your life, in a sense, you have the duty to do so, right? To prevent yourself from being killed. So that's an interesting argument, a kind of self-defense argument to some degree. And the idea that we should protect our life. Which of course we can evaluate and go deeper into that, but let's just move on to see how Socrates responds to these general claims that he gives him. So another one he says is, you're doing wrong, a moral wrong, by letting your enemies accelerate your death, right? Kill you quickly or make you die. In a sense, you're letting them win. And by letting his enemies do this evil to him, bringing him death, he's doing a wrong by letting them do that evil, he argues. So you could say that some of Crito's arguments here do make some sense, but as we'll see, Socrates finds some flaws with them. And of course, I'll leave it up to you to sort of reflect more deeply on whether you agree with Socrates or not, or maybe agree with Crito in some ways. But here we have the next argument he gives, and he says, number 9, you are betraying yourself in a sense, because you are betraying your children by not bringing them up and educating them, right? So you're leaving your children behind, you're choosing to leave your children behind, and this is a harm to them. In itself is not good, he seems to suggest, and not bringing them up, i.e. educating them properly. So it's that one you might say is a pretty strong claim. We'll see how Socrates responds to that. He then says you are choosing the easiest path, and that you're being a coward. So he's being quite strong here, saying that Socrates is a coward, actually, calling him unvirtuous in a sense, and not having the courage to escape, he's suggesting. So he's, in a sense, flipping things around as it seems Socrates would see things. And he's saying that actually escaping is the easiest path. Sorry, that allowing himself to be killed is the easiest path, rather than escaping. So he's calling him a coward for not following through in escaping, right? Suggesting that he's fearful, perhaps. So number 11 says, we will be seen as cowards for not helping you escape. So now he's going back to how Socrates' actions would affect his friends, and saying, you will give us a bad reputation and we will be called cowards for not breaking you out of prison and making you escape. Lastly, he sort of ties everything together and says, and all of this is the greatest of evil, or he puts it as a question, is this not the greatest of evils, all of this put together, right? That your enemies are winning, they're killing you, this action is affecting your friends, your family, etc. Everything we just covered. So all of them put together, he thinks is a pretty strong argument. So then, what is Socrates' response? Not surprisingly, Socrates approaches things very rationally, and he begins by saying, I'm going to cover about 5 general responses here, and then I'll leave some room for you guys to explore the text and go a little deeper in your reflections, and maybe in our next class discussions as well, we'll go in a little deeper on these answers.